What actually makes a story interesting? Is it the world, the lore, the characters? For me, it's always been the journey. It's how characters move through the world, how they change it, and how it changes them in return. When Star Rail first launched, I genuinely believed it could become one of the best gacha narratives out there, maybe even the best. Not because it was darker, not because it was more complex, but because it shows a story direction that very few gacha games are willing to commit to. Space fantasy, a real space journey, a crew traveling together, moving forward planet by planet towards something bigger than any single story. That's what I thought this game was going to be about. And that's exactly why its narrative ended up disappointing me. This isn't a video about Star Rail being bad, and it's definitely not about hating on the game. It's about expectations and potential. Star Rail set itself up as a space fantasy adventure, the Astral Express, the protagonist and their crew. That was supposed to be the main story, but over time that journey stopped feeling like the focus. Instead, the narrative shifted into a region-to-region structure, where each planet becomes its own main plot, and the space journey itself turns into a very thin thread that just barely connects them. What was meant to be the core of the story slowly became a subplot, and that's the part I want to talk about. Not because the smaller stories are bad, but because the bigger story they were supposed to serve stopped feeling like the center. What really hooked me about Star Rail at launch wasn't just the setting, it was the promise behind it. Gacha games don't really do space fantasy, not properly. You'll get sci-fi aesthetics, you'll get futuristic cities, sometimes you'll even get spaceships. But Star Rail wasn't just using space as a backdrop, it was framing itself as a journey, a crew traveling together, moving forward through the universe, seeing different worlds not as isolated stories, but as part of something larger. That immediately stood out to me. Because space fantasy isn't just about where you go, it's about movement, it's about momentum and curiosity, about the feeling that every stop matters because you're heading somewhere. And Star Rail had all the pieces for that. The Astral Express, the idea of aeons shaping reality, civilizations scattered across the universe, a protagonist whose story is tied to something cosmic, not local. At the start, it really felt like the game was saying, this isn't just about saving one place, it's about exploring the universe. That kind of framing carries weight. It makes you invest not just in the current planet, but in the journey itself, in the crew, in how they change over time, in how each world adds to a bigger picture. That's why my expectations were high, not because the game promised perfection, but because it's promised something rare. And that promise is what made everything that came after hit a little harder. It's because that promise matters so much to me. The shift in how the story was framed became impossible to ignore. At some point, Star Rail stopped feeling like a space journey. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but slowly. The Astral Express was still there, the universe was still big, the aeons were still looming in the background, but the story stopped moving forward in a meaningful way. Instead, each new planet started feeling like its own main story. You arrive, there's a local crisis, you get involved, you resolve it, and then you leave. And while these stories often connect back to the larger universe, they don't feel like steps in a journey anymore. They feel self-contained. The space fantasy, the thing that originally framed the entire narrative, started functioning more like connective tissue than a driving force. The Express became a way to travel between arcs, not the emotional core of the story. And that's where the region-by-region format starts becoming a problem. Because this structure works really well for world building. It lets each planet shine. It introduces new cast, cultures, and conflicts, but it also fragments the narrative. Instead of building momentum, the story resets emotionally with every new location. The crew doesn't evolve much between regions. The journey itself doesn't feel like it's going somewhere. Geographically, we're moving. Narratively, we're treading water. And that's the moment where the space fantasy promise started losing its weight. Not because the individual stories are bad, but because they stop feeling like parts of a larger voyage. They feel like destinations without direction. And I think this becomes especially clear if we look at Amphorius. We've been there for a long time now, and the story there is, for the most part, very self-contained. It has its own conflict, its own characters, its own resolution. Yes, by the end it does connect back to the larger universe, but for most of its runtime, it exists almost entirely on its own. And the bigger issue isn't even that it's self-contained. The real problem is how little the protagonist and the crew actually matter to how the story unfolds. They're present, they're involved, but they don't drive the conflict. They don't meaningfully change its direction. They don't reshape how it develops, and they don't come out of it fundamentally different people, which is strange, because this is supposed to be their journey. The Astral Express crew are framed as the protagonists of this space adventure. But in practice, they often feel like observers inside someone else's story. That weakens them, and you can see it most clearly in the protagonist. At this point in the narrative, we are very far in, and yet the protagonist hasn't really changed. There's no strong shift in the worldview, no meaningful internal conflict that carries forward, no sense the journey itself is leaving a mark. This was already true early on, but the longer the story goes without that growth, the harder it is to ignore. And that's where the disappointment really settles in, because this was supposed to be their space journey. And the more the story leans into self-contained regional arcs, the less the journey feels like it actually belongs to them. I've seen people argue that this is intentional, that the Trailblazer is meant to be an observer, and on its own, that idea isn't a problem. Even an observer can work narratively as long as the story commits to it. The issue is that Starvale doesn't. Most of the time, the Trailblazer is treated like they're just there to witness events unfold. But when the story reaches its climax, when there's a final boss or a decisive moment, the narrative suddenly needs them. They're pulled into action. They're positioned as essential. They're the ones who resolve the conflict. So the story itself doesn't fully treat them as an observer. It treats them as one until it's no longer convenient, and then it asks them to matter. And that inconsistency is what makes the whole argument fall apart for me. If the protagonist is important enough to act when it counts, then the journey leading up to those moments should be shaping them too. And when a journey stops changing the people on it, that's when a story like this starts losing its emotional weight. Space journeys work because of progression, not just moving through space, but moving as people. In a story like Starvale, the journey should be doing something to the crew. It should challenge them, wear them down, force them to confront things they can't just walk away from. But when every region resets the emotional stakes, the growth never really sticks. Each arc has its own conflict, its own resolution, and once it's over, we move on. The problem is that very little carries forward. The crew doesn't meaningfully change their dynamic. The protagonist doesn't gain a new perspective that reshapes how they approach the next world. The journey doesn't feel cumulative. So even when individual stories are well written, they don't add up to something larger. And that's especially damaging for a space fantasy, because space as a genre is about scale, about continuity, about the sense that everything is connected even when it's far apart. When the story keeps shrinking itself down to local conflicts, that sense of scale disappears. The universe feels big, but the narrative feels small. And that disconnect is frustrating, because Starvale clearly understands how to build ideas. The Aeons, the Stellaron, the factions, the cosmic rules that govern everything, all of that is there. But those ideas rarely press inward on the characters in a lasting way. They exist around them, not through them. And without that pressure, the journey stops feeling personal. It stops feeling like something only these characters could experience. Which is a shame, because the foundation for something much stronger is already in place. That's why, despite all of this, I don't think Starvale's narrative is beyond saving, because the potential is still there. The universe it's building is genuinely interesting, the Aeons are compelling, the ideas behind the Stellaron, belief, fate, and cosmic order are strong. None of that disappeared. What feels missing isn't imagination, it's focus. The story still has everything it needs to make the space journey feel central again, to let the Astral Express be more than just a vehicle, to let the crew be shaped by what they experience, to let the journey leave marks that carry forward instead of resetting. And that's what makes this frustrating. If the foundations were weak, this wouldn't bother me. I wouldn't care enough to talk about it. But Starvale keeps showing flashes of what it could be, moments where the scale clicks, where the universe presses in, where it feels like this journey actually matters. Those moments just don't linger enough. So when I say I'm disappointed in Starvale narrative, I don't mean that it's bad. I mean that it feels unfinished in the wrong way, not unresolved, but unfocused. It set itself up as a space fantasy journey, and somewhere along that way that journey stopped being the center of the story. I still enjoy individual arcs, I still like the characters, and I still think the story has the potential to be something special. That's exactly why this bothers me, because if Starvale ever decides to truly commit to that original promise, to make the journey itself matter again, it could still be one of the strongest narrative in the genre, and I honestly hope it does. Now, if you made it this far, thanks for listening. I'm genuinely curious how other people feel about Starvale's story, especially if you had similar expectations when the game first launched. If you agree, disagree, or see things differently, feel free to share your take in the comments. I do read them, and I like seeing how other people interpret this stuff. And if you enjoy this kind of narrative-focused discussion, leave a like, it really helps the video, and subscribing lets you know when I upload the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.